Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network, Groong, Week in Review. We are recording this show a couple of days late on January 11th, 2022. I'm Asbed Bedrossian. Hovik Manucharyan has the day off, but he'll be with us in spirit as he helped prepare this review and show notes. So this week, we're going to talk about the following major topics. Color Me Kazakhstan, and our impressions about the normalization meeting which is going to happen on Friday, January 14th. To talk about these issues, we have with us Benyamin Poghosyan, who is the chairman of the Yerevan-based think tank Center for Political and Economic Strategic Studies, and Pietro Shakarian, who is a lecturer in history at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. His research focuses on the history of Soviet Armenia and the Caucasus. Happy New Year, gentlemen, and welcome back to our first show this year.
Thank you very much for having us. Happy New Year, Shnohavo Nortari.
Thank you. Happy New Year, and thank you for having us.
Okay, well, the new year didn't start as great in Kazakhstan. A week ago, it was January 2nd, the doubling of the prices for liquefied natural gas scheduled for the 1st of January gave rise to a popular movement sending large numbers of protesters on the streets of the capital. Initially, the government acceded to the demands and promised to continue subsidizing the price of gas, but protests took a violent turn when rioters began to attack police and other law enforcement agency headquarters. While local forces struggled to quell the riots and control the situation, Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart applied to the CSTO for additional forces to stabilize the domestic situation. He hinted that the rioters were organized through a conspiracy of internal and external forces interested in bringing about a colored revolution in Kazakhstan. Pietro, can you help us understand the basics here? Where is Kazakhstan? Why do these events matter, and particularly for us Armenians?
Kazakhstan is a large country in Central Asia. It is about the size, to give our listeners an idea, Kazakhstan is about the size of Western Europe. It's very, very large. But with that size, it's also very, very sparsely populated. It is also a country that is situated, sandwiched between Russia to the north and China to the east. It has a very ethnically diverse population. It has a Russian minority that goes back centuries. It also has many different ethnic minorities. So actually the dominant population, I should say, are the Kazakhs, who are a Turkic-speaking people. They are the main group, but even among them, there are different clan and regional divisions. But you also have, like I said, a significant Russian and Slavic minority. You have many other groups such as Koreans, Tatars, Germans, many of whom came there as a result of the Stalinist deportations during the Soviet era. The Slavic population also grew during the Soviet era, during Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign in the 1950s and 60s. So Kazakhstan is it's extremely diverse country, extremely strategic country, and a very, very large country. And it is a country that is of immense strategic significance to, of course, Russia and secondarily China. If there is any instability here, it could be very disastrous for the region, in particular Russia. So the violence we've been seeing over these past few days has been very alarming, especially considering what I just said about the ethnic diversity of the population, the location. It's also physically, we're talking about a country that is mostly steppe. It is very, very, spread out. So the Russian border with Kazakhstan is mostly comprised of steppe land. And so if there was any destabilization or any major civil conflict, or God forbid, civil war, it would have disastrous consequences on the Russian Federation and also, frankly, on China. So it is, a very potentially alarming situation that this could have gotten out of control. As to the origins and character of the protests, I think that it's important to say, first and foremost, that this has both internal and external dynamics. For internal dynamics, we see this issue with the increased energy prices, especially the impact this had on Western Kazakhstan and how working people reacted to this, right? So there are genuine socioeconomic issues at play. Mm-hmm. Just like we saw in, for example, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Belarus, all these countries have some kind of socioeconomic dynamic that motivates these demonstrations. Now, you
Right.
also have, I would contend, actually, I wouldn't contend, we know that there is an external element. We have, for example, Anatoly Antonov, who is the Russian ambassador to the United States, making the statement that there was an external element to these protests, strongly hinting at the West. And Vladimir Putin made the same statement or similar statements, very strong statements, actually referring to this in the context of the Ukrainian Maidan shortly afterwards. Then Tokayev himself also said that this had, like you said, Asbed earlier, elements of kind of like a coup that had both external and internal features. So there is this dynamic that's going on. Now, this also comes, by the way, amidst the Russian NATO tensions, the Russian tensions with the West in Ukraine. There is also now this NATO-Russia summit. This is a summit that I think is going to be of immense significance for the whole region and also for Europe on guarantees that NATO will not expand. It is a very, very serious issue. Now, this is another element that is also kind of playing into this, the geopolitical. Overall, I would say there is both external and internal dynamics when we look at this Kazakh thing. Now, if we talk about whether it's a color revolution, I actually push back on this idea of the revolutions because, first of all, I don't think the term is adequate. We use it all the time. Analysts use it all the time. The Russians use it all the time in the media. You know, they say, oh, there's like a color revolution here and there and all this. But in reality, it's not really, I don't think it is an adequate way to describe, you know, what we see. I think that this is certainly, these revolts in the post-Soviet space are tied with this Russian Western dynamic.
Right.
And I would also add, in addition to that, they take on a special significance in light of the article written exactly a year ago by former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, in Foreign Affairs, which is the leading foreign policy journal in the United States, where he basically said that we need to contain Putin's Russia at any cost, and we need to build up alliances with all these former Soviet countries, including in Central Asia. So this is not just a matter of the post-Soviet West. This is also a matter of the whole parameter of the Russian Federation.
We're always reading these events from a perspective of the West versus Russia. If we were to look at this as a revolt against prices going up and making things affordable for the population in Kazakhstan, is this a democratic movement? What's going on in Kazakhstan? How do these protests suddenly turn into riots?
Well, first of all, riots are not democratic. If you're burning down government buildings, if you're beating up policemen, if you're attacking policemen with rods, I mean, we've seen these horrible videos of what's going on. That is not democratic behavior in any way. I mean, this was also, we saw this with Ukraine too, right? So we saw the situation with Maidan, and people were saying, especially in the West, Western commentators were saying that this was a democratic revolt. I'm sorry, it's not democratic.
Okay.
When you have this kind of violence and chaos going on, this is not democratic. Now, the demands of the people, certainly a good chunk of those demands were legitimate demands, but they have been taken advantage of by certain forces within this kind of protest movement to destabilize the country, which is very, very dangerous because, again, I point to the factors of the ethnic diversity, the geography, the location of this country, what it can mean. Also, it's not too far, by the way, from Afghanistan. So just imagine, Asbed, what the ramifications could be if this country was completely destabilized.
Right.
The other thing I also want to mention, too, the response from Russia and CSTO. This is really kind of a historical change in the Russian policy toward, I guess you could call it these post-Soviet revolts. So before, if Russia was willing to live and let live and say, well, you know, this is the internal affairs of this country, now they're using CSTO in a way that the USSR used the Warsaw Pact. So if there is a potential for a country becoming confrontational with Russia or having a kind of a hostility with Russia, CSTO can come in and kind of rescue the incumbent government, so to speak. The fact, though, that we've gotten to this point that Russia is so distrustful of the situation in these countries that they would go to that step and do that, that means that we have entered a significant point of deterioration in, first of all, in primarily Western-Russian relations, and also the ways in which Russia perceives the West's actions in the post-Soviet space. So this is really quite alarming. And also, I would add too, what's really quite alarming is that the Russians have set forth this desire to manage conflict with the West. So they basically are saying, Putin is saying, look, we're not going to get along. We're not going to see eye to eye on everything, but let's kind of try and manage things. But the response you're seeing, alarmingly, from the West, from the United States, and I say this as an American, by the way, is just a complete non-recognition even of managing the conflict, which is very, very alarming.
Right. I do specifically remember that over the weekend or last week, I think Jens Stoltenberg, who is the leader of the NATO alliance right now, basically said that nobody is going to be telling them to stop advancing towards the borders of Russia. So NATO is planning to continue advancing towards Russia, which seemed to me kind of an aggressive statement at a time like this. We know that Armenia has the chairmanship of the CSTO in 2022, so Prime Minister Pashinyan has had to take the lead in responding to President Tokayev's request for help. The CSTO's response has been very swift. One day there's a request, second day there are people flying to Kazakhstan. Pashinyan also included 100 Armenian servicemen in the response. And of course, he has been slammed for that, both domestically and externally. Benyamin, what is your take on his response? Did he do the right thing? Could there have been a more appropriate response by Armenia? What are your impressions about this?
First, I would like to elaborate a little bit on what happened in Kazakhstan, and then we'll touch upon CSTO reaction and Armenia's behavior. So Pietro spoke about external and internal dynamics. First of all, regarding the color revolution, or did we have a color revolution in Kazakhstan? I mean, first of all, we should clarify the terms. If under the color revolution, we understand the process somehow supported or organized or instigated by the West, a political protest to kick out the incumbent government and bring anti-Russian forces, like happened in 2003 in Georgia, when definitely Saakashvili was pro-Western anti-Russian guy and he came to power. So in Georgia, we have to accept that Shevardnadze itself was a pro-Western guy, and the move of Georgia toward Euro-Atlantic integration started back in 2000 when Shevardnadze was president. But in any case, and also in Ukraine, when pro-Western Yushchenko was fighting against Yanukovych back in 2004, and then in 2014, when Yanukovych, at that time incumbent president, decided not to sign association agreement with Ukraine, again there was a protest, and there was a clear division that there are political forces, pro-Western political forces, political parties, leaders like Saakashvili in Georgia, like Yushchenko in Ukraine in 2004, or like it's Yatsenyuk, Klitschko, and other guys in Ukraine in 2014, who were perceived as pro-Westerners, and they made protests. They came to power, like there was a clear attempt or clear effect of changing the government from allegedly pro-Russian forces into the pro-Western forces. But if we are looking what happened in Kazakhstan starting from January the 2nd, and especially January 5th, when the protests became violent, we cannot say that there were any political force behind this. I mean, there was no leader, there was no single political leader who came and say, okay, I am leading the protest movement because I believe that Mr. Tokayev as an incumbent president or Mr. Nazarbayev as an incumbent chairman of Security Council, they are pro-Russians, and I want to become a president of Kazakhstan, and I want to pull Kazakhstan out of Eurasian Economic Union, Collective Security Treaty Organization. I have Euro-Atlantic aspirations. I want Kazakhstan to become member of NATO at least.
Well, I would push back on this a little bit. What I would say, if you allow me to elaborate on this,
of course,
that of course, if we look at even the revolt in Ukraine, of course there were leaders, but not even necessarily one leader. You had Turchinov, you had Yatsenyuk, you had Klitschko. There was even division there that Klitschko was more pro-German and more pro-European than, say, some of these others. I mean, already you had the leaked audio recording where Victoria Nuland was saying, Yats is our guy. So there were many forces, even in the Ukrainian Maidan. It wasn't just a single person. And just because you have many different forces does not mean that there was no element of it. Again, I would point to these statements that were made by officials in Russia and in Kazakhstan that indicate that there was some support. Such high-level officials would not make these statements if they did not have intelligence. They would not be so bold as to make these statements without intelligence. So that, I think, is an important aspect. Whether or not they want to join NATO is another thing, altogether. But I think certainly there was definitely an element. There had to have been, because, again, these officials, Antonov, Putin, who's the highest official you can get in Russia, saying this, I mean, that is very significant. They would not, again, make such statements without intelligence.
But in Kazakhstan, there was a point that we reached somewhere between the 2nd and the 5th of January. I think Benyamin was referring to this, that it started as a protest against rising prices, and suddenly it morphed into something which was anti-government, basically to bring down the government. Initially, the protests were not meant for that.
Well, and the same thing we could say even when we look at, like, let's say Armenia, that the so-called Velvet Revolution of 2018 was initially not meant to bring down the Sargsyan government. It was only about the single demand that Serge made a promise and he broke it, and that he should step down. And only later did it become about Nikol Pashinyan assuming the prime ministership, him pushing his way through, using the force of the crowds to make himself the prime minister, which is a very undemocratic move, by the way. This is the same kind of move, frankly, that Mussolini did in Italy in 1922, where basically his forces surrounded the Italian parliament and forced the parliament to make him prime minister. This is exactly what Nikol Pashinyan did. And so it is not inconceivable that a social issue could be used to advance something else.
My point was just that if we speak about the color revolution should have the leader. My point was that the protest in Kazakhstan had no leader. There was only one guy, this former banker and minister, Mr. Ablyazov, who was a banker and then minister, but approximately 20-25 years ago, in late 1990s, who then left Kazakhstan. There was a trial in Kazakhstan against him. There was a trial accusation in Russia against him, and he was in Interpol list. But at the end of the day, he was granted political asylum by France. And only this Mr. Ablyazov made several statements that, okay, I am behind this riot or protest in Kazakhstan. But frankly speaking, we have no reliable information to say that really the people who were protesting or rioting in the streets of Almaty and other cities, they really perceive Ablyazov as their leader, and they really want Mr. Ablyazov to come back to Kazakhstan and become a president or prime minister. So my first point is that it's difficult to speak about color revolution because obviously there was no leader, or at least during this 1 week. And still there is no leader. I mean, there are no clear persons. And even now, when situation is being analyzed and some up to 8,000 people have been arrested in Kazakhstan. But again, there is no single statement, even by Mr. Tokayev. During his today's speech in parliament, Mr. Tokayev spoke about some external forces, but again, no name. So who was the leader of this protest? I mean, who was supposed to become a new president or incumbent president of Kazakhstan if the riots were successful and Mr. Tokayev was going to be pushed out? Okay. So this question remains open. And second issue is that speaking about internal dynamics, also, we have to take into account that while Mr. Nazarbayev, who was president from 1990 until 2019, 29 years, he stepped down or resigned in March 2019, and Mr. Tokayev became president in summer 2019. But Mr. Nazarbayev kept much power in his own hands through his position as a chairman of the Security Council. And so Mr. Tokayev in last 2.5 years, he was perceived as if not a puppet of Mr. Nazarbayev, but like everybody had a feeling that in Kazakhstan still Mr. Nazarbayev is a real decision maker.
Power broker.
And interestingly, when we saw the initial days of the protests, January 2nd, January 3rd, January 4th, the protest was not against Mr. Tokayev, but mostly against Mr. Nazarbayev, because people were shouting, old men, go away. Like an old man, they mean Nazarbayev, who is 81 years old. And then, very strangely, this riots, these protests become violent, and the law enforcement body simply disappeared. And we have to accept that the law enforcement bodies, and especially the Kazakhstan Security Service, the National Committee, National Security Committee, it was controlled by Nazarbayev. And the head of this National Security Committee was most trusted person of Nazarbayev, Karim Masimov, who was prime minister during Nazarbayev's presidency, who was chief of Nazarbayev's administration, and who was the chairman of this Kazakhstan National Security Committee since 2016. And suddenly we see that protests started. People had slogans against Mr. Nazarbayev. Then somehow they become violent. Very strangely, there are no law enforcement bodies. People are taking buildings, putting fire. And here I fully agree with Pietro. There is zero democracy in killing policemen, putting fire buildings, and etc. If anyone argues that this was movement for liberal democracy, then maybe we should accept that, for example, Islamic State was a liberal democratic movement, which is of course nonsense. But in any case, so my understanding is that also there was this internal division between Mr. Tokayev and Nazarbayev, because what Tokayev did on January 5, he publicly made a statement that from this day, I am becoming the chairman of Security Council. So he effectively dismissed Nazarbayev. And by the way, there was no official statement by Nazarbayev about his resignation.
Right.
Simply Tokayev said that, okay, from this day, I am the chairman of Security Council, which effectively means that Nazarbayev was dismissed. Second, he dismissed this director of National Security Committee, this Mr. Karim Masimov, from his position. And very interestingly, 2 days later, on January 7, Masimov was arrested. And Masimov was arrested on accusation of state terrorism. And Masimov is now in jail. The most significant loyalist of Mr. Nazarbayev is in jail. So from my perspective, there was also a huge domestic or internal dimension on this. Most probably, Mr. Tokayev decided that it's a time for him to stop to being a puppet of Mr. Nazarbayev. And maybe Tokayev thought that, okay, there was really objective routes for people to complain. Because yes, Kazakhstan is a huge country. I believe it's 8th or 9th biggest country in the world. 2,700,000 square kilometers. Huge natural resources, oil, uranium, other natural resources, grain, and etc.
And only 19 or 20 million people.
Yes, 19, less than 20 million people. Strong economic growth, but also growing economic inequality or social inequality, growing in employment. Very few billionaires, but a lot of people earning maybe less than $500 per month.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe Mr. Tokayev decided to use these objective reasons for resentment among low and middle classes and to push it forward against Mr. Nazarbayev, seeking to use the protest somehow to weaken Nazarbayev or end his position as a man under the Nazarbayev shadow. And then Nazarbayev, using his control over law enforcement bodies and especially over these national security committees, these secret services, decided to organize some riots, and using these riots maybe forced Tokayev to resign, telling that, okay, you cannot govern. And here, from my perspective, the Tokayev's decision to apply to CSTO, it was not only because there was a real external attack against Kazakhstan, or as Mr. Tokayev mentioned, 20,000 terrorists invading Kazakhstan, because it's a really strange statement how these 20,000 terrorists can invade Kazakhstan within few days, or if they came to Kazakhstan in previous years, it's also very strange that simultaneously 20,000 people took arms and started to fight against Kazakhstan. So my understanding is that Tokayev applied to CSTO help simply to protect itself from local law enforcement bodies and security services who were under Nazarbayev control. And definitely, I'm pretty sure that before publicly applying to CSTO, Mr. Tokayev spoke with Mr. Putin. So he knew for 100% that Russia is going to send forces. So from my understanding, this apply to CSTO by Tokayev was done to somehow show these domestic law enforcement bodies or domestic security services that, guys, I have the protection of Russia, so you are simply not able to kick me out. And interestingly, he made a statement that Mr. Masimov is fired from his position as a director of National Security Committee, that Mr. Nazarbayev is fired from his position of chairman of Security Council. 2 hours later, he applied to CSTO. few hours later, CSTO made a decision to send troops. And when CSTO troops, or mostly Russian troops, arrived in Kazakhstan, 24 hours after first Russian soldier entered Kazakhstan, Mr. Tokayev arrested Mr. Masimov.
Well, one thing I would say, if we talk about this internal dynamics, like the elite division of Kazakhstan, of Kazakh politics, I think that it is certainly interesting what you're describing. And many others have described this as well, too, by the way. I mean, like if you go to EurasiaNet, people have talked about this issue as well, this division between Tokayev and Nazarbayev. But I am a little bit more skeptical because on January 8th, there was a report issued in TASS that Nazarbayev was in direct and constant contact with Tokayev, which is really interesting because if they are in conflict with each other, then why is there a report that they are in close contact? So my point is that we don't fully know the internal elite dynamics of what's really going on.
Also, over the weekend, I think there was a statement by Nazarbayev throwing his full support behind Tokayev.
Interestingly, and also there was no statement by Nazarbayev himself. This is very interesting that, okay, we hear statements from Nazarbayev press secretary, we hear tweets from Nazarbayev advisor or assistants, but I didn't see any public statement by Nazarbayev himself, at least since January 5th.
Himself.
So for last 7 days, Nazarbayev is out of publicity. I mean, there is no video footage of Nazarbayev.
The other thing also I wanted to mention too about this, so yes, he has not made a statement. It could also possibly be that, for instance, his own dismissal was cleared ahead of time with Tokayev. It could have been a political move on the part of Nazarbayev to help kind of meet a demand maybe of the streets. So, I mean, again, there's just so many dynamics we don't know about this, that it is a very, very complex situation at the elite level when we look at Kazakhstan.
Yeah, I fully agree. And that I will just touch about the CSTO and Armenian decision issue, because I should spoke about that, but we dig deeper into internal or domestic dynamics. And I agree with Pietro that unfortunately, definitely we lack the reliable information to make some conclusions. We are able only make assessments.
Yeah. So taking this step back to what Benyamin said, if Tokayev and Putin had already agreed on the CSTO response to his request, then Prime Minister Pashinyan's response was predetermined. So primarily we would be interested in understanding how appropriate was it to include 100 Armenian servicemen in the response, whether he should have done that, whether he shouldn't have done that. What do you think, Benyamin? I know that you have
spoken about this. Yes, I fully agree that Pashinyan has no chances, and also there was no offense for Armenia or Pashinyan to veto the decision to send CSTO peacekeepers or CSTO military mission to Kazakhstan. It would be nonsense because definitely this was a much higher game.
Mm-hmm.
And simply for Armenia to veto this decision, it was senseless. Definitely Armenia should vote for. Because again, this is a game for much bigger players than Armenia itself. And simply say, okay, I'm going to veto this decision. It was, frankly speaking, it would be a stupid step by Armenia. Simply stupid step.
Yes, absolutely.
But what Armenia could do from my point of view, and I also shared this in my articles, both in English version published in Europe and also in Russian language paper and in Armenian interviews, I don't believe that it was 100% right decision to support the CSTO decision or vote for the CSTO decision to send peacekeeping mission. But I don't believe that it was a right decision to include these 100 Armenian soldiers into this mission. And I will try to elaborate why I think so. First of all, Armenia simply could state that, look, guys, my own territory is under occupation since May 2021. And this is a fact, that Armenian territory is under occupation, at least according to Armenian government. So according to Armenian government, Armenian territory is under occupation since May 2021 and Armenia under aggression in last at least 7 or 8 months. So Armenian government could say that, sorry guys, I'm not able to send any troops outside Armenia because my own territory is occupied. So I need my army here to try to end occupation of my own territory. As far as my own territory is occupied, why I should send some troops outside? Mm-hmm. So I believe this could be a quite ironclad explanation why Armenia is not going to send these troops. But the key reason why Armenia should somehow avoid sending the troops, because of course, as I mentioned, there is nothing democratic, which what happened in Kazakhstan, it has nothing to democracy, is for 100%. But we all know that geopolitics is a game with double standard, triple standard, or maybe more and more standards. So definitely the West, both political and expert circles, they are depicting this situation as a fight between democracy and autocracy. They are representing this situation in the lens of this President Biden Democracy Summit. They are telling that, look, authoritarian Russia, again, using brutal force to crash another democratic movement in post-Soviet state. And secondly, they are presenting the situation as another burst of Russian neo-imperialist feelings that Russia de facto occupies under the umbrella of CSTO or seeks to occupy Kazakhstan. And there are parallels between the decision to send troops to Kazakhstan and with the decision of Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact Organization to send troops to Budapest in 1956 or to send troops to Prague in 1968. And also in Western expert circles and in political circles, now there is a circulation that, okay, by agreeing to be part of these punitive or occupational forces of Russia, Armenia made a final choice between democracy and autocracy, and he want to be a servant state or puppet state of autocratic Russia. And even some American experts put tweets that, okay, Armenia as a servant state of Russia, or Nikol Pashinyan as a servant state of Russia, sent troops to Syria to support dictator Assad. Now Pashinyan sends troops to support Russia in crushing Kazakhstan, fledgling democracy, or occupying Kazakhstan, which means that if tomorrow Russia will start war against Ukraine, Armenia and Pashinyan will send soldiers to also occupy Kharkov or Kiev and etc. So given that if we look through the pure geopolitical terms, I mean, if we compare Armenia and Azerbaijan through pure geopolitical terms, both from Russian point of view or from the US point of view or from the EU point of view, purely in geopolitical terms, Azerbaijan is a much more important country than Armenia, which means that, okay, we all know that geopolitical interests are among the first in every country, including United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, and etc. But also we have to accept that there are some circles in these countries which argue that besides geopolitical interests, values also should play, albeit small, but some role in foreign policy. So, okay, it should be 80% geopolitics, but 20% values, democracy, human rights, etc., etc.
But it's also interesting, though, because when you look at Azerbaijan, the value issue just completely goes out the door. There are a lot of commentators in the West who have been peddling this line of Azerbaijan being a secular, Muslim progressive country, and Armenia being a pro-Russian autocracy. Even, going back to like 2000, if we're talking about Robert Kocharyan's time or Serge Sargsyan's time, there was this idea that Armenia is a kind of pro-Russian autocracy and it's part of this Russia-Iran axis versus Azerbaijan, which is so progressive and let's say pro-Western or this kind of a thing. So there was that. And I think that there, of course, is an element in the West that ideologically allied itself with or also kind of latched onto this hope of the so-called Velvet Revolution in Armenia. But at the end of the day, now we're seeing the geopolitical realities emerge. So values, yeah, they are important, but it's not an absolute. And values are important in some cases, but they're unimportant in other cases. And this is almost kind of like a test in some ways.
Yeah,
beyond geopolitics and foreign politics, there's also the domestic concerns. And a couple of days ago, military expert Karim Vartanesian pointed out that Armenia's National Security Council chairman Armen Grigoryan had essentially explained why Armenia sent servicemen to help control Kazakhstan's domestic unrest. He said it's because the Armenian government wants to show by example the kind of response it wants to see when and if it becomes destabilized by political unrest. Right? So there's a self-preservation angle to this. What do you think, Benyamin?
Yes, unfortunately, our Secretary of Security Council made the statement that Armenia hopes that he will receive the support of CSTO in the same situation. Of course, we cannot penetrate into Mr. Grigoryan's brain to understand what he meant. But according to his words, yes, he means that, okay, Armenian government hopes that if sometimes there will be protests, street protests or violent protests against incumbent Armenian government, then
Yeah.
Armenian government hopes that CSTO will make the decision and Russian, Kazakh, Belarusian and Tajik troops will arrive in Armenia to support incumbent government against violent protesters. But coming back or returning back to the value issues, and if you look into these Western experts who are Azerbaijani lobbyists and who have some clear connection with Azerbaijan, they are now disseminating these ideas very staunchly that look, the so-called chance of democratic Armenia, which maybe appeared in 2018, now this chance has gone. So at least Armenia is as authoritarian as Azerbaijan. And the idea is behind this. Okay, if Armenia is a servant state of authoritarian Russia and is fully supporting Russian authoritarianism, so in that case, West, United States, European Union should treat both Azerbaijan and Armenia purely based on geopolitics or only on geopolitics. And if Armenia and Azerbaijan are both the same level of authoritarianism, and we should dealing with them only based on pure geopolitical terms, then definitely we should support Azerbaijan more than Armenia, because geopolitically, definitely, our Azerbaijan has much more influence. He has several hundred kilometers of border with Iran. He has oil and gas. At the end of the day, he is a linkage between Caucasus and Central Asia, and etc., etc. He has long border with Russia and so on. So
and also too, I mean, with the link to Central Asia is very important because, as you know, Benjamin, Western, and actually, as we both have written, we co-wrote in this article recently, that Azerbaijan is seen as the conduit to, Central Asia. I mean, and many Western analysts, pro-Azerbaijani, lobbyists have been saying that for a very long time.
You mean for the West, Pietro?
For the West.
Yes, for the West, yes. To use Azerbaijan as a launchpad or as a conduit to also penetrate or continue their penetration in Central Asia. So my point is that by sending these 100 Armenian soldiers to Kazakhstan, Armenia gave the possibility to Azerbaijan to continue to tarnish its image as a self-servant state of the authoritarian Russia, at least to be as authoritarian as Azerbaijan, and again to dismiss any notions that at least those circles in the West who believe that somehow values should be included in the foreign policy. Again, I fully understand that in the West, the geopolitics is number one, and maybe values have only 10% of importance. But even for these 10%, they want to say, okay, Armenia has nothing to do with this 10%, because look what Armenia is doing. It's sending troops to support Russia to occupy another post-Soviet space, Kazakhstan, post-Soviet state Kazakhstan, or at least Armenia sends troops to support authoritarian or dictator Putin to crush this fledgling democracy in Kazakhstan. So I don't think that this was a good idea.
In fact, Azerbaijani fake accounts have been spreading rumors that Armenian troops in Kazakhstan are going to commit a quote-unquote second Khojali in Kazakhstan.
There's a joke I've heard in Yellowfont that, well, we lost a good chunk of Artsakh, but we gained Kazakhstan. So, so it's like that kind of thing.
It would be too funny if it would not be too sad.
Yes, that would be hilarious.
Unfortunately, and frankly speaking, I don't see any effort by Armenian government to fight this narrative because, okay, our Secretary of Security Council made a statement that we send troops to Kazakhstan because we want to show that we didn't change our foreign policy vector. Very strange statement, frankly speaking. And then he said that, okay, we hope that the same will happen, that the same way CSTO will support our Armenia, which means that, okay, he hinted that, okay, if there will be protests in Armenia, we hope that Kazakh, Belarus, and Kyrgyz troops will come and, I don't know, to do what, like to secure Zvartnots International Airport.
Do you think Azerbaijan's response is opportunistic, or do they have real interests which they're strategically responding to?
No, I believe Azerbaijan's interest is to continue to tarnish the image of Armenia in the West, like to discredited Armenia in those circles of the West who again believe that also value should be somehow be part of foreign policy to discredit our Armenia. My understanding is, and definitely Turkey will do this. Also, of course, there are some discussions, but again, we have a lack of information that maybe Russia choose Tokayev instead of Nazarbayev, if we believe that there was a such choice and Russia decided to support Tokayev against Nazarbayev, because maybe Nazarbayev inner circle was becoming more pro-Turkish. The Nazarbayev inner circle played a role in transforming this Turkish Cooperation Council of Turkish-speaking state into Organization of Turkic State, and this transformation happened in Turkey just 2 months ago in November 2021. Of course, we lack reliable information to argue that really this is a case, that inner circle of Nazarbayev becoming more and more pan-Turkist or pro-Turkey, and this was the reason behind Russian decision to support Tokayev against Azerbaijans. But at least some Russian analysts arguing this, and some Turkish experts are complaining that, okay, Kazakhstan leaders should not apply to CSTO, but Kazakhstan should apply to the Organization of Turkic States for the support. Why Mr. Tokayev applied to CSTO?
I would throw out something else kind of related to this as well, too. I mean, I think Nazarbayev, by doing his moves with Turkey and also his moves with the West, frankly, he is essentially trying to pursue the same foreign policy that we saw from Mr. Yanukovych in Ukraine, that we saw from Serge in Armenia, that we saw from, actually Lukashenko even in Belarus, to balance between Russia and the West, to kind of flex the independent muscle of Kazakhstan as an independent state. And I think that was what his aim was, but I think similar to the other leaders who I just mentioned, I think he overplayed his hand, and I think he underestimated those forces that he thought he could control. And so, for instance, one line I've been hearing from Russian analysts is this idea that he was too cozy, not only with necessarily the West, but also with Kazakh nationalists. Because this is a big issue now in Kazakhstan. You have Kazakh nationalists who say, well, we should make a more national Kazakh state. We should Latinize the alphabet. This was one very controversial move that Nazarbayev recently did, to Latinize the Kazakh alphabet. And Russian analysts, as we saw with the recent... We saw the recent tweet of Margarita Simonyan, very, very well known. I mean, she's the head of RT, Russia Today, to write that, okay, so we'll help you, but on these conditions. And the second condition was to revert back to the Cyrillic alphabet, the first being recognition of Crimea, and the third being make Russian the second national language like Kyrgyzstan. So this was another source of Russian elite frustration, that Nazarbayev was trying to have it both ways, like Serge, like Yanukovych, like Lukashenko. So in all these respects, Nazarbayev was trying to kind of play the independence card. Actually, frankly, I would even argue Shevardnadze was trying to do the same thing in the lead up to the Rose Revolution in Georgia.
And Pietro, I think one more point that was included was ousting anti-Russian NGOs.
Well, that's a very important point too, that we also should remember that, okay, so many of the participants of the protest are people who have been recipients of money and funds from these NGOs, right? Now, that's also something that many critics of Nikol Pashinyan and the so-called Velvet Revolution have also pointed out in the case of Armenia. Many critics have also pointed out with Belarus. And of course, obviously with Ukraine and Georgia being the most obvious examples, that this is seen as if the West, and specifically the United States, if back in the day, their approach toward regime change was, let's say, a coup d'etat, let's say in Chile, or maybe even military intervention, if we look at the case of Iraq, right? Also, the other famous example of coup would be Iran in the 1950s, as we know, with Mossadegh being overthrown and the Shah being put in, and we see the result of that today in Iran. But there is also this idea that now NGOs are the new soft power, are the new conduit for regime change in this part of the world. And it's actually a quite convincing argument.
Right. We addressed a number of the issues that I wanted to talk about, and that had to do with the Russian interests and their response. Frankly, the way I would look at this whole Kazakhstan incident is that some spontaneous economic protests began in the country, and there was an opportunity for Turkey and the West to make a little bit more of it, possibly turn it into some kind of a colored revolution. But because of the CSTO's very swift response and the relationship maybe between Tokayev and Putin, closed that opportunity down very quickly. So that didn't happen.
And also, one thing I wanted to say, Asbed, one wonders, I mean, this is like a counterfactual, but one wonders What if that had been the Russian response? I'm sure a lot of Russian hardliners tonight are telling Putin this, that I wonder, what if you had done the exact same thing in Ukraine in 2014 or 2004? There would not be any Maidan. We would have the situation under control, and things would be under wraps, right? This is what the Russian hardliners are saying to Putin. The other thing also about this NGO thing I want to stress is that there are NGOs who do very good work in post-Soviet countries who receive foreign grants. And part of the tragedy of all this is that they are going to be on the receiving end, a reaction against them because of all these revolutions we see. So it's going to actually, these so-called, we can call them, I question this idea of a color revolution, but these revolts in post-Soviet space that have external support, they are hurting democracy here. They're hurting the building of democracy here, right? So for instance, the most vivid example of this recently in the post-Soviet space has been the case against Memorial. We saw this in Russia, the case against Memorial. Memorial being
a Memorial is a Russian NGO.
Russia NGO. It has deep roots. It was founded by Andrei Sakharov, the dissident, with the intent of building a memorial to the victims of Stalinism. And it also became a major human rights organization as well, too. And now, I cannot think of an organization that is more kind of, as the Russians would say, nastoyashi Russian, that's truly Russian. It's a truly Russian organization. But because it has received foreign support on that technicality, it's being shut down. Right. So this is a clear example of how we can see through this foreign agent law, which was passed by Russia in reaction to all these revolts in Ukraine and Georgia and Kazakhstan and Armenia even, and Belarus, that this is hurting democracy in the region. This is hurting the natural process of democratization. And frankly, the people of Russia and the people of the post-Soviet space are more than capable of democracy. We saw this with the thaw, Khrushchev's thaw in the 1950s. It wasn't the West who came in and denounced Stalin and de-Stalinized the country. It was an internal process in the USSR. Or perestroika is another internal process in the USSR toward democratization. So the idea that the West has to come in and teach, it's demeaning, it's insulting, that we can't think for ourselves.
Also, we have to look forward, because interestingly today, during the special session of parliament, when Mr. Tokayev presented his quite ambitious program of reforms to reforming both army, law enforcement bodies, economic reforms, and etc., he also stated that, okay, starting from January 13, CSTO peacekeeping forces will start to leave Kazakhstan, and this entire process will be finished within 10 days. This was today's statement by Mr. Tokayev.
Yeah.
But also today, the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu stated that CSTO peacekeepers will stay in Kazakhstan as long as needed to provide security and stability, and didn't mention any time frame. So this is also for me interesting, that President of Kazakhstan is stating that, okay, CSTO forces will start their withdrawal started on January 13, and this protest will be finished on January 23, while the Russian Ministry of Defense on the same day is stating that they will stay there as far as there is a need for stability and security, and we are not able to provide any time frame. I'm not sure what does this mean, but this is also interesting dynamics.
Very interesting. So we'll keep watching this issue. Let me move on to our next topic. A few days ago, we had an in-depth conversation with Harut Sasunyan about the Turkish-Armenian normalization negotiations that are being embarked upon by the two countries. And as you know, the two negotiators, Serdar Kilic and Ruben Rubinian, will be in Moscow on Friday, January 14th, for their first meeting of this process. I wanted to ask each of you your thoughts and expectations and potential outcomes that you might expect from this meeting. Pietro, what do you think?
I think that, it's not going to result in anything significant. I think that at least it establishes kind of like a line of dialogue between Ankara and Yerevan. But I don't think it's going to lead certainly to any breakthroughs. I think the space of disagreement is still much more significant. And the other question is, how far is Russia willing to go to support this? So Lavrov made the statement that Moscow supports Turkish-Armenian reconciliation. But if this process goes too far, as we know. I mean, we've discussed that in this program, let's say. Russia could lose out potentially in the region, and Turkey could end up, dominating Armenia. If Armenia just decides to open up the border with no restrictions or something like this, simply if Nikol Pashinyan wants to stay in power and wants to reap economic benefits immediately, I think that is a serious concern on the part of Moscow, even if they say publicly that we support this process. Yes, we are for, kind of a dialogue. Now, again, that being said, I think that this is just something that I think would be good as a means for establishing a kind of like a contact, but I don't think it's going to result in any breakthroughs.
Benjamin?
My understanding is that I don't exclude that at the end of this year, at the end of 2022, Armenia and Turkey will reach to some agreement, at least to establish diplomatic relations and maybe to open Armenia-Turkey border.
Do you think there'll be embassies opened?
If not embassies opened in December 2022, at least preliminary decision will be made that, okay, we are going to have embassies in 2023. Why I think so? Because all external players are for this. Also from different point of view, United States supports this because in any case, they believe that this will strengthen Turkey's position in South Caucasus. And despite all tensions between US, Turkey, NATO, Turkey, and all some love affair between Erdogan and Putin, in any case, I believe US still believes that Turkey is a significant threat for United States or the West in the South Caucasus. Russia wants stability in the region after this 2020 geopolitical earthquake. And from Russian point of view, at least the start of the normalization between Armenia and Turkey will facilitate the stabilization. But Russia, of course, has some doubts that either Turkey or Armenia may try to play their own game. That is why Russia decided to fully control the process. And that is why I'm pretty sure that Russia argued or demanded that the first meeting took place in Moscow to be fully under Russian control. But in any case, and the European Union, they always for normalization, opening up of communications, economic cooperation, etc., etc. Azerbaijan is not against it after its victory in 2020 Karabakh War. Iran may be concerned about possible more increase of Turkish role in the South Caucasus, but Iran has no capacity to prevent this. So from Iranian point of view, if you are not able to prevent this development, you should adapt. You should do everything to decrease the negative outcomes, or you should do everything even to take some advantages. So Iranian position would be this, not to try to prevent this protest, because again, they lack resources to do that, but to adapt to this new situation when there is Armenia-Turkey diplomatic relation. But the key problem for me here is that, of course, even adversaries could have diplomatic relations, like India, Pakistan, and even Russia and Ukraine have diplomatic relations.
Right.
They don't have embassies, but they have diplomatic relations, despite Ukraine argues that Russia annexed Crimea and occupied some part of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. So to establish embassies or open embassies is not a problem. The problem for me is that Armenia accepted or realized Turkish preconditions to start the process, and that is unacceptable for me. The whole tragedy for me in this situation is the fact that de facto, at least de facto, Armenian government not only accepted but realized several key Turkish preconditions, maybe due to the incompetence or whatever reason is it. And now we start the process because from outsider point of view, situation is this. Okay, Turkey told Armenia, you will do ABC, and then I will start to talk to you.
Right.
And this ABC is absolutely against and violating Armenian vital national interests.
Yeah.
But Armenia did ABC, and now Armenia and Turkey start to talk. This is unacceptable for me, because if the price to pay to have diplomatic relations with Turkey or to have Armenian embassy in Ankara or Turkish embassy in Yerevan, the price is for Armenia to state that Karabakh should be part of Azerbaijan, which our prime minister effectively stated on December 24, 2021. This is unacceptable for me. So I'm not against the normalization process. I'm not against having Armenian embassy in Ankara or Turkish embassy in Yerevan. I'm not against opening of Armenia-Turkey border. But I am against to declare Artsakh as a part of Azerbaijan for starting the protest or to having Armenian embassy in Ankara or Turkish embassy in Yerevan. And this is a problem.
I also would throw out something else too really quick. With Russia controlling this process, in some ways, that's actually good because if, let's say, Nikol Pashinyan wanted to give away more to Turkey, if he wants to give away so much more that it infringes on Russia's interest, then Russia will limit it. That's the one positive thing you can bring out of this. I fully agree with Benjamin about the preconditions.
Pietro, I'm not sure that Russia is controlling the process. It's managing to be included, or maybe managing the process from my perspective. But I understand what you're saying. Okay, to close off our topics, thank you very much. We've arrived to that moment where we can maybe get things off of our chest. Benjamin, do you have anything you want to get off your chest?
Okay, it's interesting to also follow these Iran nuclear talks because according to several diplomatic and official sources, the sides are very close to reach, if not a final agreement, at least to some interim agreement for 2 or 3 years, at least the end of Biden administration, which will bring US back into the deal and which will cancel the sanctions which Trump imposed on Iran. And this is really interesting development, which will also have implications for Armenian South Caucasus.
You mean this is about the JCPOA?
Yes, I'm meaning that sides are very close after this 1 year of negotiations. Sides are close to, if not sign a final deal, at least to sign some so-called interim deal for 3 years period, which will effectively mean interim deal at least as far as Biden is US president.
All right, Pietro, what do you want to get off your chest?
I'm going to, give a rant on a different topic, which is this idea of, the Western-Russian relations. My rant is actually directed toward the American government and the Biden administration specifically, that the American government, if it cared about American national security, it should sit down and talk with Russia. It should find a way to manage the conflict. Because if this gets out of hand and there is no management, the only thing we have is hot war. It's not going to be a Cold War anymore. It's going to be so now, as they say, as Mr. Gorbachev even has publicly stated, we're in a new Cold War. And if we're in a Cold War, you have to manage that from becoming into a hot war. The problem is, if the Biden administration is not even willing to manage conflict with Russia, then it's going to be very bad. And the people who are going to suffer the most are the people on the front lines. And I'm talking specifically about people in, first and foremost, the post-Soviet space. Kazakhstan, but also, the Caucasus, Armenia, right? Armenia being Russia's most important partner in the Caucasus region. Ukraine, certainly, which is right on the front line there with NATO and Russia. Belarus, the Baltics, and also, frankly speaking, Western Europe, as I've mentioned before. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK. All these countries are at risk. If we have short-range nuclear missiles there in Europe and we have a nuclear war, it's going to be catastrophic. So my whole point is that the Biden administration needs to talk to Russia. And the comportment I've been hearing, the statements I've been hearing, the comportment is absolutely unacceptable. So let's hope that these NATO talks between the US and Russia can result in something positive that can seriously de-escalate a very, very concerning situation.
All right, we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Pietro. I'm looking forward to our next conversation already.
Thank you, Asbed.
Thank you, Asbed. Thanks for having us.
Okay, that was our Week in Review show, and we hope it helped you catch up with some of the issues in and around Armenia from this past week. As always, we invite your feedback and your suggestions. You can find us on most social media and podcast platforms or our website, groong.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, like our pages, and follow us on social media. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.